So hopefully you'll bear with me. I'm cheeking a cough drop here. I'm getting over something. I had planned to make a video sooner than this, but I got hit with a bug. So anyway, between the bugs online and the bugs that I've been getting lately, it's been a little tough. Anyhow, so I've got the main deck to Breya, and I've got cards that I'm not using, and I kind of want to talk about both and get some feedback. This is not meant to be a conclusive video, as in it's settled tech, but more of an exploratory video. As in, here's what I'm doing, here's why, what do you think? Maybe I should try some other things, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to start with the change that I've made to the main deck for Breya. Two minor changes. One was that I took out Vandal Blast here and I put in Fragmentize. I've been back and forth on both cards, and at one point I've had both in there. Both is probably an overkill, but the reason I made that swap is it's very rare these days for me to really get a big Vandal Blast off, mainly because I have many ways to destroy or steal artifacts already built into the deck. And so the utility of it is kind of low. It is a first turn, excuse me, Soul Ring killer, but it requires me to go get red mana instead of white, which this deck is primarily white, blue, and black. So fetching red can be a little bit awkward. The other thing about it is that Fragmentize deals with cards like Blood Moon. If you can manage to find one white, you can deal with it. Vandal Blast just looks at it, and Sylvan Library. Despite the fact that those cards don't come up too often, they're pretty threatening. I suppose the other card that Fragmentize can deal with that's really nice is Opposition. So your opponent opposition locks you out. You play a single white mana, destroy the opposition, and you get to carry on with your game. Likewise for Winter Orb, but Vandal Blast could at least do that in the past. So between the two cards, it's really a question of whether or not those, Opposition, Sylvan Library, and Blood Moon are more threatening to you, or whether or not a horde of artifacts that you haven't been able to interact with is a bigger threat. And I feel like it's unlikely with this deck for that situation to come up. And even if it does, frequently you'll ignore the artifacts for a little while and attack their hand, and then retroactively clean up the artifacts later, or just set up a situation where you've got, say, like Forbid Law, you've got Necro Forbid going, you're hitting them with a Sword of Feast and Famine. It doesn't matter that they have a bunch of artifact mana, right? So um, this is definitely a card I could see. I think it's a little bit of a personal preference, but I had one game loss within the last few weeks, and it was against a Blood Moon, and it was very frustrating drawing Vandal Blast and dying to the Blood Moon. So I made the switch back, and we'll see what I think about it in the long run. The other change I made though is I swapped out Dovin Grand Arbiter and I put in Teferi Time Raveler at the same cost. I think Teferi offers a lot more. So there's a couple of different things that this thing does that, whereas Dovin's kind of like Dovin's a card that slowly gives you incremental value that eventually will affect the board and the game in a way that you're going to win. Teferi immediately has an impact on the board and game state, and potentially can just win the game on the spot. So one of the things that it can do is, because your opponent can only play sorceries, suspended cards like Rift Bolt and Ancestral Visions will not, as well as there's an entire commander that suspends things, although you don't see them too often these days anymore, the blue-red guy. Um, so this will completely shut down Suspend, which is really gnarly for some decks, but at a minimum can be pretty good against two cards that are certainly played in their colors quite a bit. The other and have a powerful impact on the game. But of course, as we all know, it also shuts down counterspells. So that's an incredible effect to have in the mirror or against any other control deck. Um, it also shuts down miracle cards. So it stops Terminus and the Time Walk and the Wheel of Fortune effect and such. Typically, they draw it. I mean, they can hard cast it, but they're not going to be able to miracle it during their draw step, typically. So those are the first ability is really nice in general, but you wouldn't play it just for that ability. The second ability, where you can play sorceries as though they had flash, is mostly mediocre, but it does let you do a couple of pretty cool things. The most, for the most part, being able to end step ponder, preordain, um, turning Imperial Seal into Vampiric Tutor, that's pretty cool. Um, Being able to merchant scroll when you would normally have to impulse is cool. Fabricate at the end of turn is neat. Um, but the main thing that it does, a Vindicate at instant speed is really cool. But the main thing that it does, if you're going to use it, typically for as far as effects that are much more interesting as instants, is Mind Twist. So you plus this thing up, you get this thing on the board, you plus this thing up, and your opponent can't cast counter spells because of the sorcery clause, and B, you get to let them draw a card and then Mind Twist away their whole hand plus their draw step, and they can't counter it. So it's completely bonkers with Mind Twist. Um, the rest of the stuff is just cool. Instant Speed, Toxic Deluge is nice. The other card that would be really amazing with this, or Demonic Tutor or whatever, that's all cool. But the other thing that would be really nice with this would be if you could use this to play Yawgmoth's Will after the at end of turn starts. So at the end of your opponent's turn, you let all the at end of turn triggers happen, and then during their end step, you play Yawgmoth's Will, rather, and then you play all the cards from your graveyard that you can. Meanwhile, when they're done, you untap, and the will is still running, or because if it said at end of turn, in that scenario, the will would still be running and you'd have another round of Yawgmoth's Will. However, it doesn't work that way because Yawgmoth's Will says until end of turn rather than at end of turn trigger. Um, so I'll show you the wording difference. Let's take a look at Teferi. At the beginning of the next end step, you untap 2 lands with Teferi. So if you use this in the middle of the end step, you actually won't untap any lands. If you had some way to use this at instant speed and used it in the middle of your end step, you don't untap anything until the beginning of your opponent's end step, because that would be the next at the beginning of clause that could trigger. So if Yawgmoth's Will was worded at the beginning of your next end step, you can no longer play cards from your graveyard, and you were able to wait for that at beginning to happen, then you could play Yawgmoth's Will in the middle of the end step with Teferi and go to town. You'd have 2 full rounds of willing. But because it says until end of turn, what it means is when you move to your actual end step, where everything clears out, the Yawgmoth's Will clears out along with that as well, where like damage is resolved and all that stuff's over. So it won't work with that. So just kind of keep that in mind. I don't want to belabor the point, but that's um, unfortunately not as cool as it could be, but still really cool with primarily Mind Twist. All right, so the last thing, though, that Teferi does is I said it had an immediate impact on the board. Those two things are sort of long-term and, not bad. But it bounces something and draws you a card. Now, it doesn't hit Planeswalkers, but it hits everything else. Uh, Correction, doesn't hit Planeswalkers or lands, but it hits the rest. So artifact, creature, enchantments. And that can be really powerful. It protects itself, steals tempo. Like, how often do we play Jace? And you'll see this all the time in my games. I'll play a Jace, bounce their creature, and say go, right? So this does it a turn earlier and then draws a card while you're at it. With the intention of being, you can play this, bounce a threat. The next turn, they're going to have to play something on the board to threaten this thing. And then on your turn, you play Breya, and you know that they can't counter it or even end of turn remove it because of the first part of this. So now you've got Breya protecting Teferi. You plus it up and start rebuilding its counters so that you can continuously suppress. It's just a really nasty combo. Um, and pretty awesome. The other thing you can do that's cool with it is you can bounce, because you can bounce artifact, creature, enchantments, is you can actually bounce something like a Stoneforge Mystic or a Spell Seeker, Trinket Mage, Snapcaster Mage. Like, we actually have targets who we don't mind bouncing in this deck at all, or even Breya in some cases. And so it has multiple utility aspects to it. So I think the card more than likely belongs, as it's a pseudo Vindicate. I mean, it's basically a removal card, not permanently, kind of like the other Teferi is also removal. But what that's done is it's added even more ways to get things off the board to this deck that also draw cards and also does something else. And that's pretty great. All right, so I think that's much more impactful in the long run than Dovin. Now, there is an argument to be made for playing Dovin as well. I really like the card, but I'm not exactly sure what we would cut. If we're looking at trying to keep the curve, so we cut, say, Dovin for a 3-drop, perhaps you could pull, like the card that kind of stands out to me is Forbid, maybe. Um, I wouldn't be too happy with it, but perhaps, I mean, it's the weakest counterspell in here, but here's the problem. This is a control deck. All right, counter target spell, right? I'm going to type that in there, and then I'm going to come over here and apply filters. And keep in mind, this is a control deck with 99 cards in it and only 8 counter spells. And 2 of them are, well, uh, Mana Leak situational, although mostly, for the most part, you can consider it a hard counter. Remand is not actually a hard counter most of the time. The only time it is if you're playing a card, then they attempt to counter your card and you remand your own card back to your hand. Then it's a hard counter for their counter, and it draws you. And Muddle is frequently transmuted away. Um, but I mean, it is at least kind of a counterspell, right? But like 8 counterspells for this whole control deck, like it feels like a serious control deck that locks you out of the game. It feels like you're being countered at every turn, but it doesn't actually do that. So if we pull out Forbid and go to 7, I think that might just be a little bit too few. I think 8 has got to be the minimum, right? So I don't think I can pull that for a Dovin. And I'm not sure what else would make the cut. Yet again, I find, well, I'll finish that thought in a moment. All right, so for now, Dovin's out, Teferi's in, Vandal Blast is out, Fragmentize is in. Although I'm much more open to going either way with that choice. Um, so what's not being played? So Dimer Signet and Azoria Signet not being played in here. But if I am concerned about Blood Moon overall, I probably should give some strong consideration to slipping a couple more cards in here that allow me to work around Blood Moon, because that's what I prefer to do, is just leave it and work around it, eventually getting Coalition Relic down or a Chromatic Lantern preferably, and just completely ignoring it. But um, but Artifact Mana can allow me to work around it, and then I rely on Artifact Mana and lock them out of Winter Orb, and my lands don't work, then I don't care that much. Um, but there are times where I've got to get to that point, and Dimir and Azorius accelerate me into these Savage 4-drops. Of course, Karn, Kaya Jace being some of the best ones, but an early Factor Fiction, Thran Dynamo and such, very powerful. Um, Fix my mana when I have those draws that are like Mishra's Workshop, Ancient Tomb, Soul Ring draw, which I'll snap keep it, but sure would like some colored mana out of that, and Dimir and Azorius convert mana into colored. So like I'd really like to have colorless mana into colored mana. I'd really like to have the 2 cards in here. Um, Again, I'm suffering from a where do I fit them in? How do I get them into the deck? There is a thought I had possibly in which I cut Copy Artifact and Thran Dynamo, but that just seems kind of crazy, right? Like just to get more colored mana into the deck and to have mana that I can play off of a Winter Workshop. I can play Dynamo off of it, but with a Workshop, um, the problem with Workshop into these, though, is that when you Workshop into them, but then you need some other mana source to actually get them, to prime them, to get some mana into them to get out. Uh, but uh, it would give me 2 workshoppable artifact pieces rather than just the 1, plus I need a blue to copy this and can't pay for the copy with a workshop. On the other hand, I'd be dropping 3 mana to get 2, not even counting this. So at least 4 mana to get 2, and that seems like a regression. So from my point of view, the signets probably need to be in. Well, I feel like they need to be in there. I mean, also the curve is just so much tighter if I can find slots for those. But again, I run into this issue of I don't know what to cut. I don't know what to cut. So for now, the signets are out. But thoughts on that, I'd appreciate. Another card from the new set that I was really looking into and seems like it like it seems like it should have a home here, is Blast Zone. So Blast Zone comes into play with a charge counter on it. Otherwise, it's colorless mana. Um, you can spend 2 mana to add an additional charge counter. So kind of like a powder keg where you slowly charge it up. And then whenever you're ready, you can spend 3 mana and sack it to destroy everything whose casting cost is equal to the number of charge counters on Blasting Zone, which means that includes planeswalkers. Because it starts with a charge counter, you cannot play a Blast Zone and then just sack it on 3 and kill like Mana Crypt, Mox Diamond, Mox Opal. Let's say your opponent has that and you don't. So I think that is actually a drawback to the card, strangely, even though they give you a free charge. There's no way to, there's no reasonable way to get that charge off of there and kill 0 drops. Um, but it does kill important 1 drops, obviously Soaring being the most important, Skull Clamp being right up there, a Horde of Elves, for example, stuff like that. And then of course, if you want to charge it up, so you can take out 2 drops or 3 drops or whatever, all good. The problem I have with this blast zone, so what I love about it is you can expedition map for it, and it's kind of like a colorless Vandal Blast that fits a mana slot that helps you develop early and then has some utility later. It's also really sweet with Crucible. So as long as you're not actually blast zoning for 3, if you're popping it on 1 and 2 over and over, or maybe even charging it up, um, it looks like it charges really. No, it's so you can actually put X charge counters on it, which means you could play a blast zone and have a ton of mana, for example, with that Thran Dynamo copy artifact that I just thought about taking out, and then charge a blast zone up in a big turn up to some large arbitrarily large number or whatever. On the next turn, you blow it and replay it off of Crucible. As long as you're not blowing it on 3, you've got a loop of removal that would be really hard for your opponent potentially to deal with. So it seems like a great fit for this deck. But first of all, it's slow. And slow is not like we want cards that come down and immediately impact the board. Um, it probably doesn't replace a card like Throne of the High City. So Throne of the High City, the ability to become the Monarch and just start drawing 2 cards per turn for the rest of the game immediately as soon as you get this down seems like much more utility than a blast zone that you have to then charge and then eventually you can pop it. And I don't know what other colorless slot would be in the land slots. There are no other colorless slots that I would swap this out for. I mean, clearly it's not going to be replacing Wasteland or Strip Mine. So those are not even on the table. Workshop or Ancient Tomb are not on the table. That's way too much mana from those cards. And I don't think it's better than Throne. I just a land that adds a total different element to the game and allows you to draw extra cards. Unless we're finding that like consistently getting run over by decks where Throne of the High City becomes bad and Blast Zone becomes good by like go wide decks. I don't think we make that swap. So the only other way to do it would be to add in Blast Zone as a 30-second land, and I actually find that very appealing. But then again, what do we cut for Blast Zone? How do you fit a 30-second land in here? I'm already can't fit in Signets that I want to play, and those are more important due to the Winter Orb plan. So I don't know. I'm not sure that Blast Zone will make the cut in the long run. Um, and but again, this is another card where I'll talk about it in a moment as to what I kind of wish would happen in the format. Sorry. But well, I'll get to that in a moment. So anyway, then there's Dovin. I just talked about how much I love having this card, and I do. And then I took it out. So the problem is all the cards in the deck I love having in the deck. So that really can't be a qualifier for playing the cards. I mean, with some exceptions, cards that I don't necessarily love in the deck, um, but feel are kind of a necessary evil. Seal I actually kind of love because I love being able to enlighten tutor for a disenchant if I have to. But fragmentize I don't love. But we already talked about that and why I think it probably needs to stay. What I'd really, really like for them to print actually is a Swords to Plowshares, instant speed, exile target artifact or enchantment. Its controller gains life equal to its casting cost. That's the card I want them to print. And then I'll swap that out for Fragmentize in a heartbeat and never look back. Like that I would 100% play. It would be a permanent addition to the deck and it would never come out ever again. And I would really, really like for that to happen. This card is close to that often. It's almost that. If it were an instant, I'd actually feel happier about it. And the sorcery speed is kind of what bothers me. But it's about as close as you can get to that type of an effect. Um, and so that's why it's in here. But I don't love it. Um, Other cards I don't necessarily love. They're very few. It's hard to find cards that I think you can really afford to cut in this deck. It's gotten so compact, so tight over the years of playing that it's extremely difficult to find any open slots whatsoever. Um, so again, thoughts on that I'd be interested in, but Dovin, like I said, maybe it replaces like Forbid. Maybe it could replace Fabricate. I'm not sure. Um, yeah, I just don't know. The other card that I was trying out was Karn, the Great Creator. So Karn's ability is to it effectively null rods your opponent, and then you can plus one it to do Tezzeret's ultimate, but for one target artifact. And that's it actually lasts until your next turn, which means you can create a blocker, actually, unlike Tezzeret's ultimate. So you can plus one this thing on a Thran Dynamo and have a 4/4 who sits there and guards Karn. And that's not too bad, but the deck is very light on creatures and doesn't generally care if you kill its creatures. And what this does is it turns your opponent's creature removal into useful stuff. And that's actually not good. Like, I don't care if you kill a Duretti token or a Snapcaster who's already replayed something or a Spellseeker who's already fetched something. A Stoneforge, same, right? A Wayfarer who's activated once. I don't care about any of that. Um, and if you try to kill Breya or some flyers, I'm generally going to have some mana up and either get something out of your attempt at removal by sacking artifacts and Breya or the flyer, or I'm going to just replay Breya and drive on. So like the Karn, it feeds this, it creates this scenario that's a little bit painful. Now on the other hand, there are some cool things you can do with it. So you can turn one of your opponent's non-creature artifacts into a creature and steal it with Vedalken Shackles, or which is kind of interesting. Um, you can also which and then presumably you would then sack it later to Breya, and then repeat this process. But you can plus one it also to target, say, your opponent's mana crypt and just kill it on the spot, and you can plus it to maybe turn one of your artifacts into a threat that you can send into a planeswalker as a surprise. That's pretty cool. Um, but overall, if you're plussing it and targeting your opponent's artifacts in the scenario I gave you, that it sounds exciting. Remember, they're under a null rod effect while this is in place, so for the most part, you don't need to do that. For the most part, with a few exceptions, like maybe a Crucible of Worlds, uh, if they've got an artifact, most of them are just going to sit there useless anyway. So that kind of ability to mess with your opponent's artifacts, like for example, animate it and then kill it with Breya, it's great if it is a Crucible Worlds, but in general, it's kind of useless. Like you're not going to care if they have Soul Ring, Umezawa's Jitte, Vedalken Shackles, Chromatic Lantern, and a Mana Crypt, because none of them do anything, right? I mean, you'll protect Karn, assuming you can protect Karn. So while you'll probably mess with their artifacts a little bit, for the most part, it's a bit, it's not. It like gets you so far and then it stops being useful. The -2 on it, which chooses artifacts you own that are exiled or outside the game and put it in your hand, I was really excited about because I was thinking, oh wow, that's a way to get around the Breya commander tax. Unfortunately, from what I can tell, it does not work that way. You cannot actually, it's not considered outside the game or an exile. It's in the command zone, right? So unless you allow them to Swords to Plowshares or Breya and then tell it to go to exile and then try to retrieve it with Karn, it's not going to really work out. And unless you're, and alternately, like maybe you Yawgmoth's Will and then sack an artifact with Will running that you can then replay, um, there's kind of like some funky utility trick in there where you generate mana this way, but it would be extremely weird. Like basically a mana vault. You tap a mana vault for 3, with a Yawgmoth's Will running and Breya in play, you sack the Mana Vault, then you for 2, and then you -2 this, and you use the 1 floating to replay the Mana Vault, and now you have 3, but that's the 3 you had to begin with, so it's really kind of eh. So basically this card is just Null Rod for your opponent that they can attack and remove. It doesn't do a lot for you. It doesn't generate card advantage. As excited as I was to play this card, I don't think it makes the cut. It's a great stacks effect, but um, it's not exactly like it's it needs to while it's sitting there and the board state and you're both in top deck mode, that card should be providing you something. If you look at like Kaya or you look at Jace or something, if it's sitting there, even Doretti, right, which kills things, is still producing something every turn. So you're still getting something, even if there's nothing to kill on the board. You're getting those 1/1 tokens, which is very relevant for Breya and Skull Clamp. And of course, you're building up towards the ultimate, which is relevant as well. With Karn, you would just be plussing it up so that it's harder for them to kill it and just kind of waiting around, twiddling your thumbs, hoping you draw something. And that's just not good enough, I don't think. So Karn not making the cut. So the last card that I was looking at as a potential card for this deck is this Nicol Bolas. I don't have him in available. Let's see if I can. There we go. Nicol Bolas Dragon God. So the first thing this does is it's a 5-drop that you can force a will with. So that's good. It requires triple black, which is really bad, but we're set up to get triple black for Necro due to having Urborg and Gilded Lotus, so it's feasible. Then the third color being red is a little bit bad, so it's 4 off-color mana. Is kind of nasty, and you don't get to take advantage of the fact that, like with this deck, you want to tutor for Soul Ring and you want to tutor for Mana Crypt early. You want to get cards like that out, and this card can't do anything with those cards at all. So that's kind of bad. Um, Now the ability of all other planeswalkers on the battlefield is only as good as it is. That could be anywhere from nothing to uh, fantastic, but if it's fantastic in general, you're wondering if it's your planeswalkers on the battlefield, you've got a pile of them. You've already won, so this is just a win more effect. If your opponent has enough planeswalkers to make that ability really cool, well then, uh, well, it's unlikely you're going to win the game by playing Nicol Bolas, right? Like you're in a lot of trouble. Maybe you will because it can kill creatures or planeswalkers with its -3, but it can only kill one. So I suppose if your opponent had something like a Karn on the battlefield, like the original Karn, and you were able to play this, and then you could -3 and exile their Karn with this, uh, that's something. But yeah, it's kind of bad, right? It's just kind of bad in general. I mean, if they have a Jace, are you going to zero it and draw 3, or are you just going to -3 and immediately kill their Jace, right? You're going to immediately kill their Jace. So the first thing you're going to do with this is make that first line irrelevant. It's either irrelevant because you have control of the game, or it's irrelevant because you're going to kill their planeswalkers with this thing and lose your abilities. What I would have liked for this card to have said is your opponent's planeswalkers have no abilities. That would have been sweet. Anyway, having said all that, the +1 where you draw a card and then your opponent exiles a card from their hand or a permanent they control is so much worse than Kaya's ability to draw a card and take a card from their hand. If this just did that as a secondary Kaya, I'd be really thrilled by it because um, it gives you another Disrupting Scepter and a Gem Tome at the same time. And that combination of abilities is extremely hard to deal with. The fact that it also kills things would make this card like a Jam Day Tome, a Disrupting Scepter, and a Vindicate all wrapped up in one. And it would be a card, and you can force a will with it. It'd be a card you really want to try hard to play with. But because it gives them the ability to exile a permanent they control instead of a card from their hand, what you're going to get is a situation where they're always removing the absolute worst card that they've got for the entire game. Like they might have a 0/1 token plant creature from playing that County Garden, right? And you draw a card. Now that's great. Don't get me wrong, but there's a lot of things that draw a card. If I had mana, I'd much rather have Future Sight if I'm going to be drawing cards with a card that I can force a will with. That Future Sight's unbeatable. Harder, easier to cast than this, being triple blue but two colorless. And I'm not playing it right. So I wouldn't say, okay, well, let's just play this because I can draw cards. But that exile ability, a lot of times, like you're just gonna get garbage. You're gonna exile if you draw a card and you're gonna exile some random token that's not doing anything for them, a card in their hand that is completely dead because you've got something going on that is nullifying the card. That's still all right though because at least it gives you information. It's shrinking their hand size, but the fact that they get to choose, it's pretty rough. If you could choose which mode it was, if you could say exile a permanent, if you could tell them to select a permanent or a card from hand, so that way when you look at the board and you say, oh, all you've got is land, I want you to exile a permanent, then suddenly this card would be great, but that's not going to happen. They're going to always pick what's best for them, and that makes that kind of weak. Lastly, the ultimate, sure, it's a game-winning play, but it's 4 turns later, and you've already drawn 4 extra cards and exiled 4 extra things. Presumably, somehow you've gotten to that point, and your opponent hasn't interacted with this card in a way to stop you from ultimating. And if all that's going on, you've already won the game. So sure, go ahead and -8 it and win. But um, it's mostly for group where you can potentially defeat multiple opponents at once. The card gets a lot better, but in 1v1, you've already won that game. So this is a problem I have with this card. It just feels like in every mode, it's winning more. It's getting the loyalty abilities is a win more ability when you have a bunch of loyalty abilities already. Ultimate is a win more ability because you've already controlled the board for 4 turns and should have won by then. The only thing that makes me really want to play this card is the destroy target creature or planeswalker, because the more cards that you have with that kind of flexibility, the better. But is that flexibility worth the inflexibility of having to play blue, black, 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 red to get this into play? And as of right now, I think the answer is no. So those are all my thoughts on the deck and on the new cards. I haven't seen any other new cards that particularly stand out to me. There is a blue-red planeswalker. It's a Sahili type. I should have prepped that before we started, but let's see if I can grab the card. It just occurred to me, yeah, this thing, whenever you cast a non-creature, create a 1/1 colorless artifact creature, and then you can -2 to cause an artifact or an artifact you control to become a copy of another that you control. But it doesn't gain loyalty at all. So that copy thing seems a little bit strange. Uh, there might be some situation where you're like you create a servo and then the next turn you turn the servo into like a Gilded Lotus in order to produce extra mana. That's pretty cool. But these are like weird corner cases. You might copy a Vedalken Shackles or copy your Sword of Feast and Famine or something, copy your Jitte. But these are like weird cases. Not super stellar. Ultimate like is really not like I don't know. Copy a Sensei's Divining Top. That might be cool. You make a 1/1 token. You copy a Sensei's Divining Top, turning the 1/1 artifact creature into a top. You tap it in order to draw a card, and then it vanishes, so you don't put it on top of your library. So basically, you got to draw a card, but you only get to pull that off twice because it's -2, and then done. Probably not a card I want to be playing with. Just getting a bunch of 1/1 colorless artifact creatures for a non-creature spell, that's pretty cool. Don't get me wrong. I think that's actually really interesting because this deck can do a lot with 1/1s, but I'd probably rather just have Dovin because it's going to get me 1/1s. Sahili comes down and then says, hey, I promise I'll give you some 1/1s later. Dovin says, I'll at least give you one right now. And I'm not using Dovin, so I definitely am not using Sahili, even though it has the potential to produce more up front. You play Sahili, you get nothing, but on the next turn you play multiple artifacts and you get non-creature spells and you get a bunch of 1/1 servos. There are cards out there to get servos and stuff, but Yeah, you place the Healy and you get nothing, and then your opponent just kills it, vindicates it, whatever, and you got nothing. And like you just can't afford. The whole point here is that every play needs to pull you ahead and cause your opponent to fall behind, and it doesn't really meet the bill. So out of all the cards that are available, I feel like the ones I've selected are probably the ones that are most interesting for Breya. But let me know what you think. I'll be really interested in your comments. Again, sorry for the long delay on this. This is a lot of talking, but I like to do these whenever a set comes out, and I also wanted some time to play with the cards and see what I thought. Um, but anytime there's a set that comes out, and we get to make even one change to this deck, in general, I would say that's a good situation because in order for a card to even make it into this deck, it has to really offer something interesting, powerful, or efficient, more so than every other card that's ever been printed for the most part. And that is a tall order. So the fact that we actually managed to get a card in here, I think, is pretty exciting. And I look forward to some games with this and finding out whether or not my instincts on this are correct. But I think that they will be. If the rules hadn't changed, if the rules hadn't changed with Planeswalkers, and I could not play two Planeswalkers of the same name, then this Teferi, I would consider that enough of a drawback where I would have clunky hands where I've got this on 3 and this on 5 and I can't do it. I consider that enough of a drawback that I would play Dovin over Teferi in that slot just to avoid those situations from coming up. But because that's no longer the case, I think that I think that this is the configuration that I'm good with for now. And we'll keep an eye on the Fragmentized versus Vandalblast situation and see if we can fit those signets in. All right, that's it. Thank you very much for watching. The next video will be some gameplay, which hopefully you will enjoy, and you will get to see how it works. I believe what I'll be looking to do is try to get games with Teferi so you can see Time Reveler with TTR here, so you can figure out what you think about it based on actually seeing it in action. But until then, well, I'll have to call it a wrap here, and thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.